Welcome. This is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and this is Exploration. Every week on Exploration, we discuss the fascinating world of science. And today, once again, leading off, we're going to summarize some of the top stories in science. Well, the lead story today, and in fact, the lead story around the world, concerns the historic meeting between the heads of the United States and North Korea. In fact, for 50 years, the two countries have been locked in a very hostile dance. And the question is this the way to break the stalemate? So we'll talk about the pros and cons of this historic meeting between President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. And we should also say that the media, much of the media simply yawns and says, well, there's nothing new. We knew it all along. Nothing great. Well, I tend to disagree with this. I think there was a historic breakthrough made, and now we're entering the next phase. The next phase concerning whether or not we can verify the denuclearization of Korea. That chapter in this historic summit still has yet to be written. And also we'll say a few things about Mars. NASA played coy last week, saying that there was big news concerning the red planet. Big news that'll make headlines. It did, but the question is, what does it mean if NASA finds evidence of complex carbon organic chemicals on Mars? Does this mean that Mars has life, or once upon a time had life? We'll talk about the potential of life on Mars. And then we'll say a few things about sleeping. It turns out that roughly 15% of the population, suffers from something called sleep paralysis, which has now earned the attention of many scientists, and they find a correlation between, well, being an athlete and having sleep paralysis. And some people think there's even a connection between sleep paralysis and alien abductions by aliens from outer space. Well, let's just jump right into some of the top stories of the past week. The lead story today concerns the historic breakthrough, which is a real game changer in terms of world politics, between President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. Korean War, the United States and North Korea have been locked in a deadly stalemate. A stalemate to gain the atomic bomb, even a crude hydrogen bomb, and they can hit the United States anytime they feel. And so then the question is, well, what is the meaning of this summit? Some people say, yawn, nothing new. No big breakthroughs. Well, I tend to disagree. I think that this was the beginning of something that could really change the whole politics in Asia and affect world politics, especially the situation with regards to Iran. First of all, both sides made concessions. So it wasn't simply ho-hum, nothing new. Both sides said some rather important things. First of all, President Trump surprised the Pentagon and the South Korean government by pledging to stop the war games that have angered the North Koreans for many a decade. It turns out the United States and South Korea performed full-fledged war games that North Korea, with some justification, believes could be a precursor to an all-out real invasion of the North. And President Donald Trump, in a gesture to the North Koreans, has pledged to stop the war games unilaterally. This, of course, surprised the Pentagon. The Pentagon was asked for a comment, and the Pentagon said, well, we're awaiting orders from on high, which, of course, means Donald Trump. And the South Koreans were also caught flat-footed. But everyone in South Korea, I think, agrees that it would reduce tensions between North Korea and the United States and South Korea if the United States temporarily suspends the war games. Because these war games can be a precursor to an actual invasion of North Korea, says the North Koreans. Second of all, Donald Trump said that he's entertaining the idea of eventually removing U.S. troops from South Korea, up to 30,000 U.S. troops. In fact, twice that number of U.S. troops are in Japan. Not only to save money, said Donald Trump, but also to reduce tensions Because if you have almost 30,000 U.S. troops right at the border with North Korea, then, once again, the North Koreans, with a certain amount of justification, can say that, well, it looks like a precursor to an invasion. And that's what the North Koreans want to have eliminated. And then next, Donald Trump made the key statement, and that is sanctions will remain in place until the nukes are removed. And so this is going to be one of the main things that North Korea wants to bargain. North Korea wants the sanctions to be removed, but the process of removing the nukes has to also begin as well. So Trump made several gestures to the North. And then what gestures did Kim make to the United States? Well, first of all, the media yawned and said, oh, nothing new. But you see, that belies the point. You see, in the past, what the North offered was a freeze on nuclear weapons and the beginning of talks to reduce nuclear weapons a bit. However, now we're talking about denuclearization, complete, irreversible denuclearization. This is now on the table. It wasn't really on the table before. People would give lip service to a degree. But now the process could be being initiated, especially given the fact that North Korea blew up most of its nuclear test site. Now, to be fair, we should point out that satellites that have photographed every square inch of North Korea shows that the nuclear test site used by the North Koreans collapsed because of the enormous impact of its small hydrogen bomb that it detonated. So that hydrogen bomb actually disturbed the geology of the mountaintop, and the mountaintop collapsed. So in some sense, it was not a grand gesture that the North Koreans blew up its nuclear test site, but the very fact that it did so rather than lying about it, I think shows good faith, at least in this instant, that North Korea is serious about engaging in talks concerning denuclearization. And then what's also on the table is the end of the Korean War. I mean, think about that. It's been over 50 years since the armistice was signed between the North and the South. And now, after over 50 years, people are talking about ending the Korean War. Now, so far, so good. We're off to a good start, and it represents two different strategies. One commentator said something rather interesting on TV. He said that historically, when the United States, South Korea, and North Korea engaged in talks, it was always bottom up. That is, the staff met first. The staffs of the two powers would spend months, years going all over all the small details. And then after the staff made recommendations, the big shots on the top would simply reverse them, and the whole process would start all over again. Or sometimes the North Koreans would use all the delay, and sometimes the North Koreans would use this whole process of all the staff going together and meeting to disguise the fact that it was cheating and building its nuclear facilities up. Now, however, instead of bottom up, we're going top down. In other words, the top leadership of North Korea and the top leadership of the United States are going head to head, 1-to-1, establishing a rapport, establishing the ground rules, and then they'll tell their minions and staff to dot the I's and cross the T's. And so this process has cut through decades worth of obstructionism, decades worth of bureaucratic lethargy, decades worth of misunderstanding by going top down. Now, of course, this is just the beginning. This is nothing but step one. Step two requires getting a timetable. In other words, now that North Korea has said that it is open to the idea of denuclearization, then the question is timetable. Specifically, what does it mean to denuclearize? What is the pace? What's going to be denuclearized? And then the question is, as denuclearization progresses, will the United States begin to ease up on sanctions? And so this is step two. It's going to be a very long process because we're going to have to go reactor for reactor, nuclear waste site for nuclear waste site, nuclear testing area for nuclear testing area. All the things have to be looked at and cataloged to make sure that they don't cheat like they did in the past. And so step two is going to be onerous. And step three is, how do you verify everything? Once you got the timetable in place, once you begin the process of denuclearization, then the question is, how do you prevent cheating? The key word is irreversible. How do you make sure that they suddenly don't revive their nuclear weapons program? How do you make sure? Well, that's step 3. And so I think the media is too harsh on this whole question. We're witnessing a historic breakthrough where the very ground rules have shifted, meaning that the two powers in the United States and North Korea have at least agreed on a basic framework to begin the process of creating a timetable and the whole question of verification, which of course will be done by staff. And so I think that a tremendous breakthrough was made. And then a long-term process involves human rights violations. Just remember that when Nixon went to China back in the 1970s, that changed world history. World history was altered when the leading anti-communist in the United States went and visited Chairman Mao, the leading communist in the world, and they found some common grounds, and that changed world history. But human rights violations, you can argue, are still going on even today, even though China has liberalized its economy and liberalized much of its social relations between the government, the army, and the people. And now let's say a few things about outer space, specifically the planet Mars. A few years ago, when the $2.5 billion Mars Curiosity rover was drilling into the soil of Mars, NASA announced that there's going to be a tremendous breakthrough, a press conference that's going to change the whole discussion around the planet Mars. But then something happened. We had a setback. The drill broke. It turned out the drill, which was drilling right into the Martian rock, well, the drill had a motor, and the motor petered out. As a consequence, for 2 years, people have held their breath, wondering what was that press conference that NASA was about to make, but then delayed it because they had this tremendous setback. Well, NASA finally owned up and said, yes, they're going to have that press conference. And the press conference was, in fact, a game changer, but it was not exactly the revolutionary discovery that was advertised. First of all, they were able to jury-rig that drill. That drill is still broken, but from a distance of millions of miles, NASA was able to communicate with the Curiosity rover and jury-rig the drill so that it began operations drilling into the Martian rock, getting powdered samples of the interior of the planet Mars. Well, given that fact, NASA then had this long-awaited press conference, and they announced that, yes, it's going to be very important. First of all, I hate to be a party pooper, but NASA did not announce the discovery of life. First of all, the Mars Curiosity rover, it had its principal mission, which was to find evidence of microbial life. NASA has long since abandoned hope of bumping into Martians or Martian civilizations. It has much more modest goals, picking up Mars. And so, at first, some people thought that NASA would announce that they found microbial life. Well, no. It turns out that what they did find was evidence of complex carbon-based organic chemicals. That is, the precursor, the building blocks of life itself. Now, let me explain. Mars, once upon a time, cooled down before the Earth. When the Earth was molten over 3 billion years ago, Mars already cooled down to the point where it had rivers and oceans and plenty of carbon. Now, why carbon? Carbon has 4 bonds. And because it has 4 bonds, it can join with other carbon atoms to form long chains. And these chains can become hydrocarbons or the precursors of organic chemicals. It turns out that amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and the hope was that amino acids would be found on Mars. Not proteins, but the building blocks of proteins. Well, it turns out that even on the planet Earth, when you find meteorites and cut them open and then analyze the interior of these meteorites, bingo, you find remnants of amino acids. And in fact, when you look at nebula, that is gas clouds, many, many light years in outer space, in deep space, and analyze them through a spectrograph, what do you find? Evidence of amino acids, the precursors of proteins, which in turn makes up most of our body. And so the hope was that NASA would find evidence of amino acids. Well, not quite. What NASA did announce was the fact that they found evidence of complex carbon-based organic chemicals. In other words, the precursor of the precursor. They did not announce the discovery of amino acids, but they did say they found evidence of complex carbon-based organic chemicals. Now, realize that Mars once had a great ocean, that it lost roughly 3.5 billion years ago. So Mars probably had a great ocean and rivers and streams for about 500 million years. And then the question is that long enough to get DNA off the ground? You see, DNA is not a protein. Proteins are quite complicated, but DNA is the stuff of life. Why? Because it can make a copy of itself. It is self-replicating. And every time it makes a copy of itself, it copies the code of life, which is embedded in the sequence of molecules along the chain. So that would be the key to finding life on Mars. Well, they didn't find that, but they did find evidence of complex carbon chemistry, which indicates that Mars once had conditions conducive to forming DNA and eventually microbial life. So we're not there yet. In fact, perhaps the rovers of the future will have more ability to sample soil and drill into the soil of Mars. For example, NASA is already thinking about putting a helicopter on Mars. A helicopter on Mars would have to spin much faster than a helicopter on the Earth because the air on Mars is so thin. Atmospheric pressure on Mars is 1% that of the atmospheric pressure on Earth. So from our point of view, the atmosphere of Mars is almost a vacuum. And it's made out of carbon dioxide, not oxygen and nitrogen like on the planet Earth, but carbon dioxide, which is suffocating to a human. And so with a helicopter, however, NASA would be able to rapidly comb the surface of Mars looking for areas where there was once upon a time flows of liquid water. In fact, the Curiosity rover is stationed near the Gale crater. And why is that? Because there seems to be some evidence that once upon a time water flowed freely in that area. And that's why they chose the Gale crater to concentrate on in their search for evidence of potential microbial life. So with a helicopter, NASA would be able to scan the entire surface of Mars and then pick and choose where to drill, pick and choose where to look into the center of Mars using seismographs and using drills. So in other words, we're not there yet, but we're making progress toward one day showing that Mars perhaps had the conditions conducive to create microbial life. Also in the news, sleep. That is, scientists are now focusing on some of the mysteries concerning sleep, which is ironic, of course, because we humans spend almost half our time sleeping, and yet we know so little about the nature of sleep, why we sleep at all, why do we dream. In fact, on Exploration, I had one of the world's leading scientists about dreams and sleeping, and I asked him, why do we dream? And he said, quite frankly, that after centuries of speculation and research into sleeping, we still don't know why we dream. However, one study, which is quite interesting, came out of the University of Arizona recently, and it concerns athletes. It turns out that roughly 15% or so of the human race suffers from something called sleep paralysis. Maybe you, in the audience, suffer from sleep paralysis. First of all, when we dream, we are paralyzed. That's right, we are paralyzed when we dream. Because if we weren't paralyzed, we might act out our dreams and cause all sorts of havoc in the process. In fact, some people have been known to chop wood, drive cars, and even kill their wives while they were dreaming because they argued before a jury that they suffered They were long-term chronic sufferers from sleep paralysis. Well, it turns out that these people who have sleep paralysis, when they wake up in the morning, they're still paralyzed. Now, when we wake up in the morning, that is the average person waking up, the paralysis is gone, the memory of the dream is gone. But these people still have remnants of the dream, and they are paralyzed when they wake up, and they are frightened. They have this mental image that there is an animal or some kind of ogre or gremlin sitting on their chest, bearing down on them, making them paralyzed, causing them to be frightened. Well, when you do a brain scan of these people, you find that the amygdala is stimulated. The amygdala is the seat of emotions, especially fear, and that's where nightmares come from. So it turns out that the average person, when they wake up, well, the paralysis is gone, the dream is gone, but for those people who suffer from sleep paralysis, they're still dreaming when they awake, and they are still paralyzed, and they have this mental image that there's an animal sitting on their chest. Now, when I teach astronomy at the college, I have several hundred students, and I ask them, what fraction of you people suffer from sleep paralysis? And sure enough, every time I ask that question, about 10% of the class raises their hand and says that they have sleep paralysis. One person told me that when she wakes up in the morning, she has this image of a cat, a large cat staring down on her, and she's paralyzed and she's frightened as a consequence. During the Victorian era, in fact, there are paintings. You can Google this. There are paintings of women waking up in the morning with a gremlin standing on top of their chest, staring down on them. And this is a motif that was very common during the Victorian era, and they're paintings reproducing this fear. Now, what causes it? Why do we have it? We don't know. But one study done at the University of Arizona was quite interesting. First of all, in their sample, they showed that about 18% of the people in their study had sleep paralysis. And they found out that there was a larger proportion of people with sleep paralysis who were athletes. What a strange combination. The theory is that athletes are more exhausted. They sleep sounder as a consequence of all that exercise, and perhaps that's the reason why the number of athletes who suffer from sleep paralysis is higher than in the average population. Now, why are scientists interested in sleep paralysis at all? Well, for several reasons. As I mentioned before, there are several lawsuits involving people who have destroyed property, even killed people, and they claimed they had sleep paralysis. In fact, on Exploration, I even had a scientist who was an expert on sleep paralysis who testified in murder trials, and the perpetrator said that he suffered from long-term chronic sleep paralysis. But there's another reason for studying sleep paralysis, and this is the whole phenomenon of alien abductions. It turns out that a significant fraction of the average population of the country claim that they've been abducted by flying saucer people. And the routine is rather similar. Usually these memories are evoked with a hypnotist. The hypnotist then asks questions concerning nightmares and feelings of fear, and all of a sudden people begin to talk about the idea that they were kidnapped by aliens from outer space, and that the aliens are standing over them and performing experiments on them, sometimes experiments on their sex organs. Well, scientists have studied this, and they notice several similarities. First of all, people who suffer from sleep paralysis are slightly sexually excited when they wake up. And we have the same fear, the fear of people standing over them, glaring down on them, and the feeling of paralysis itself. And scientists also zero in on the fact that hypnosis is not a very credible way to extract memories. In fact, under hypnosis, you can actually implant memories of things which never existed at all. And the hypnotist can often lead the person being hypnotized into going into certain avenues that never happened, but the hypnotist can skillfully weave a tale. For example, the hypnotist can say, what do you see? Do you see a bright light? Do you see a bright light coming down? And perhaps somebody is coming out of the bright light. And so it's possible that a hypnotist can also lead the person being hypnotized. Now, does that prove or disprove alien abduction? No. Who knows? Maybe these people actually were abducted by aliens from outer space. You can't rule it out. It's certainly possible. Carl Sagan himself once wrote an essay saying that many, many centuries ago, if an alien were to land on the Earth, we would think of them as being godlike. We would think of them in horrible terms, perhaps, because of the fact that we're so primitive and we fear the unknown. And so you cannot simply dismiss it. However, my personal point of view is as follows. If you are ever kidnapped by an alien from outer space and taken on their flying saucer, for God's sake, steal something. I don't care what it is. An alien chip, an alien hammer, an alien screwdriver, steal something. And remember, there's no law against stealing from an extraterrestrial civilization. You're not going to go to jail. There are no laws against stealing from an alien civilization. And you'll have bragging rights. Instead of simply telling the press that you were abducted by flying saucer people and having people snicker at you, you can produce an alien chip, alien DNA, alien tissue, anything that would prove that you've been abducted by aliens from outer space. Well, I'm afraid that's it for the first part of Exploration. In the second part of Exploration, we're going to continue our discussion about sleep paralysis. In fact, we're going to bring on Michael Shermer, founder of the Skeptics Society and leading skeptic that you've probably seen on television talking about UFOs and flying saucers. And I caution you, some of the things he says may, go against what you believe in. But listen to him because he has a definite point of view. Once again, this is Dr. Michio Kaku, professor of theoretical physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. In the second half of Exploration, we're going to bring on as a guest Michael Shermer, founder of the Skeptics Society and the Skeptics Magazine. Now, before we begin an interview with Mr. Shermer, let me give you a cautionary warning. Some of the things he says may disagree with how you view reality. Well, listen to him. In other words, he may have a different point of view. He may even get you angry about some of the things that he talks about. But, hey, look, he has a point of view, and his point of view is well worth listening to. The first question for you, Dr. Shermer, is explain to us the Skeptics Movement.
Well, we started the Skeptics Society and Skeptic Magazine in 1992, but there's been for half a century a skeptical movement that was kind of begun by Martin Gardner and James Randi and others when the whole business about Uri Geller and the spoon-bending psychic stuff was picking up steam in the 70s. That's when the modern skeptical movement really took off. And our magazine, the purpose of it is to, two things. Really, we are debunkers, let's face it. There's a lot of bunk out there, and part of our job is to, like trash collecting, it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. And so that's part of it. But to me, that's not the most interesting thing. I mean, like lining up the claims of the creationist or 9/11 conspiracy people or whatever and answering them one by one is something somebody needs to do, and that is what we do. But on a larger scale, I'm more interested in the power of belief, how belief systems work, how people come to believe such weird things. I wrote a book about this, why people believe weird things. I mean, it is an interesting question, particularly smart people. College professors believe weird things. And So how does that happen? I mean, if they're so smart, what's going on here? And the short answer, as it turns out, is that most of our beliefs are held for non-smart reasons. That is, psychological, emotional commitments that we make depending on our peer groups and mentors and where we were raised and the beliefs of our parents and things like that. And then we back up into the beliefs using rational arguments to justify them after we already hold those beliefs. And so that's something I've learned in this job.
And I guess there's no gene for rigorous scientific thinking, right? I mean, no one's born by saying that things have to be falsifiable, testable, reproducible. We humans sort of like grab onto anything that comes along sometimes, right?
Yeah, that's right. We're not natural-born scientists, although we are natural-born causal seekers. I mean, we're pattern-seeking animals. We look to connect the dots A to B to C, and in the natural environment, often those dots are really connected. They really are causally connected, and we're good enough at it to be able to survive and have evolved to where we are now. But the problem is that we make a lot of false positives, these so-called type 1 errors, in which we assume something is real when it's not. And generally, it doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't take you out of the gene pool, and to assume that there's something there that isn't, like, let's say, if I spin 3 times to the left, it'll bring on the rain or be good for fertility or something like this. That doesn't cost me anything. It's not going to take me out of the gene pool. So we've inherited the capacity for superstition and magical thinking. And then it's only one small step from that to also assuming that other agents have intentionality. That is, agents like other animals, other people, other animals. You don't have time on the plains of the savannas of Africa to calculate whether that cheetah or that lion is interested in you or not. The safest thing to do is just always assume he has intention, and the intentions are bad. And so run like hell. And so if all agents have intention, which is an easy assumption to make, then it's a small step to assuming so does the inanimate world. Planets, rocks, trees, the lightning, clouds, they all have intention too. And something with intention is an agent, a being, a god, if you will. So there you see how we get from animism to polytheism to monotheism. That is, we assume that there's some causal agent in the universe at work, and that today we call God, but other people and other times call it something else.
Now, I understand that some brain scientists have looked at something called epileptic lesions, damage to the brain, whereby people see causal things everywhere in the universe if they suffer from epileptic lesions. If it rains, it's because they did something bad the other day. It's a punishment. Almost anything around them has some kind of supernatural causal basis to it. And this can actually be induced artificially, I understand. Yeah,
this is the work of several scientists. Ramachandran at UC San Diego does stuff on temporal lobe seizures and how that generates incredibly intense religious experiences, including the hearing of voices and whatnot. There's a guy named Michael Persinger at Laurentian University who I went and did this. He puts this helmet on your head and bombards your temporal lobes with electromagnetic patterns, waves of patterns, and he's able to generate very, very mild, out-of-body experiences and the sense presence in the room. You're in this little isolation room that's completely quiet. And so by doing that, he hopes to try to replicate how it is that some people have these remarkable experiences. But I don't think that explains why people believe in God, because the average person who says they believe in God, 92% of Americans say they believe in God. Most of them don't hear voices. They're not talking to angels. They're not sensing aliens or angels coming into their room and nothing like that. They believe because they were raised to believe. They were raised in a Christian culture. Most of their parents are religious, and that's why most people believe. It has to do with psychology and culture more than anything else.
And also, you said it doesn't take you out of the gene pool to believe in these things, but doesn't it actually strengthens your chance of survival to complete the dots? I mean, if you think you see a tiger in the forest, you complete the dots and you say, oh, there's a tiger there, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But 9 times out of 10, there's no tiger.
Yeah.
There's no face on Mars. There's no Donald Duck in the clouds in the sky. But the brain says, by God, it looks like Disney characters up in the sky. And the brain does that naturally because, in some sense, 1 time out of 10, it actually probably saves your butt, right?
That's right. So magical thinking and superstitious thinking is actually just part of a larger, what I call a belief engine. That is, we just form causal connections and beliefs about everything. And sometimes they're true. They're true often enough that it helps us. But the rest of the time that they're not true, the false positives, so what? It doesn't really hurt us. So we've inherited that. It's never going to go away. I have job security at Skeptic.
Okay.
People will always be believing weird things.
Okay. And let me ask you a personal question. Why get into this business? Because it's a thankless job. You probably get a lot of angry letters from fans of Bigfoot. You probably get a lot of angry people saying, how dare you question whatever. It's a thankless job. Why do it?
Well, I do get some of those letters, but I get far more letters thanking me from scientists in particular who appreciate what we do on the fringes of science there and defending science and science education. And, you know, it's like they don't have time to do it. Scientists are busy doing their science, and so somebody has to do this. And also we're constructing a whole worldview, a scientific worldview, scientism, if you will. And in a sense, it's not an all-encompassing thing, but it does attempt to give some spiritual meaning to people's lives who don't believe in God. That is, I think, if spirituality is a way of being in the world in which you have a sense of awe and wonder about things bigger than you, what does that better than science? I mean, a Hubble Space Telescope photograph of the expanding galaxies and all that, wow, that's just incredibly awe-inspiring. So that's another thing that we do, is to try to be there for people as a resource that, you know, hey, there's other people out here who embrace this scientific worldview.
Let's move on to some other topics, because your organization, of course, handles everything. What about those people on television at night getting a lot of response that say they can talk to dead people? And it's quite dramatic. You see them out there in front of an audience, and afterwards they're tears and crying and sobbing as the family members say, yes, yes, yes. We thank you so much. You have given us insight into our dearly beloved who just passed away.
Yeah.
Well, what are your thoughts about talking to dead people?
Right. Well, it turns out anybody can talk to dead people. It's getting the dead people to talk back that's the hard part.
I see.
And that's all they're doing, really. Really, it's a show. It's a type of psychic, it's a type of magic called cold reading, mentalism, where you pretend or you fake or you appear to be talking to dead people. You appear to be getting information from the other side is what it is, and it's a trick. So, first of all, the people are prepped. They're ready. They're there because they want it to be true, so that makes it especially easy. Then you don't have to get a lot of hits. In fact, you only need to get about 1 out of 10 statements. We've done a lot of studies on these. In the course of a 1 hour reading, half hour reading, whatever, a psychic will say hundreds of things, 200 to 300 different comments and questions. And if they only get, say, half a dozen to a dozen right, the person going away is completely convinced. They'll come away and go, that's unbelievable. He got the name of my uncle, George, who passed over. Yeah, but if you actually look at the tape, he went through half a dozen to a dozen names before he got to George, or he didn't even say George. He said, I'm getting some sort of a father figure. Who is this, please? And then the person will say, oh, that's my uncle, George. He passed over. And then the guy will come back and say, like 10 minutes later, go, no, I'm getting somebody here. Don't tell me his name. It feels like an uncle. Is his name George? And the person will fall over just completely shocked that the psychic was able to get this. But in fact, he didn't get it. They gave it to him. And that's very typical of these kinds of things. So it's a trick. It's a cold reading. Anybody can do it with a little bit of practice, and nobody can talk to the dead.
And also the audience, aren't they a little bit selfish? I mean, they want something. What they want is forgiveness because this person passed away with unresolved problems. And they want that reassuring statement that from on heaven, these people forgive you. And that's why they break down and sob.
Yes.
So isn't it the audience, aren't they in some sense an unconscious partner in this whole thing, in the sense that they want something? They want forgiveness.
Yep. Right. There's unsolved. Actually, if you do these things, I've done a couple of readings for TV shows and stuff. I always say something like that. There's some unfinished business here, isn't there? And the people, they cry, oh, yes, that's right. I wanted to tell him that I loved him. Something like that. Or, you know, I wrecked his car. I owe him money. I want forgiveness for sin. Something like that. But even more so, it's just sort of odd that if the dead really wanted to talk to us, why would they come up with the most inane things like he's telling me something about a red dress, or he's giving me his name. His name? He already knows his name. She knows his name. Can't we move on to something a little more important about the unfinished business? There are always these trivial little things, and that tells us that it's phony.
And also, if you can really talk to the dead and understand their secrets, you would know where buried treasure is located. You know where all sorts of riches and wealth can be found.
I always ask these guys, tell me where, talk to Jimmy Hoffa and ask him where his body is. You know, where's the body, Jimmy? Because he would know, right?
I suppose he would know, right?
I would hope so.
Okay, well, moving on. Your organization, of course, talks about a lot of things, so let's quickly just do a few things, like Bigfoot or Bermuda Triangle. Quickly, what does your organization say about those people who think there really is something to Bigfoot? Or
well, in this case, it's not impossible. There might be, a bipedal hominid roaming the hinterlands of the northwestern United States. Who knows? But in biology, in order to name a new species, you have to have a type specimen, a holotype, a specimen that can be photographed, dissected, passed around, put in a museum, studied by other scientists. That's how you name a new species. You can't just do it based on blurry photographs and grainy videos and anecdotes about weird things that go bump in the night. That doesn't constitute naming a new species, discovering a new species. So what I say to them is, show me the body. And until then, it's reasonable to be skeptical.
And also the famous videotape of Bigfoot walking away from the camera.
Yeah.
There's a man who claims that he is that man in the monkey suit.
The guy in the ape suit, yeah.
And he claims how he did it. He goes into quite a bit of detail. He knew the people who first surfaced with the tape. He was good friends with them. And he says that the three of them went into the forest, and he was basically afraid that some hunter would kill him because he was running around in a monkey suit. And that's why they, of course, didn't have that much footage of him, because he didn't want to be shot at.
Yep, that's right. Well, sometimes people claim hoaxes, they don't actually do them. But I think it's possible in that case he actually did. It certainly does look like a guy in an ape suit, clearly. But, there's no smoking gun. No one's turned up the actual ape suit yet. So we'll see.
And what about the Bermuda Triangle?
Well, there you have an effect where all these wrecks allegedly happens to be the area where there's probably the most shipping traffic in the world and the worst storms and hurricanes in the world. So just by that alone, you're going to get a lot of unusual seafaring accidents and things like that. If you control for the baseline of how many accidents you would expect for that amount of traffic and that kind of weather, it turns out nothing unusual happens.
Okay, and what about alien abductions? Some people claim that it is nothing but sleep paralysis involved, but explain.
That's the best theory we have going now. That is, we do know that a certain percentage of the population, maybe 1 out of 50 or so, has sleep paralysis. That is, you wake up in the middle of the night in which you're so relaxed you feel paralyzed, like you can't move. You're not actually awake. You're sort of in a dreamlike state, but you feel like you're awake. But your body is prone and seemingly paralyzed. You can't move. And then you have a sense presence in the room and a feeling of something like comes into the room and sits on your body, sits on your chest. In the Middle Ages, they called these the night crusher. The crusher that comes in the night. This is a nightmare is what it was, a nightmare. And then they called them incubi and succubi. These were, demons. Satan sent them in. And 100 years ago, it was ghosts and poltergeists that came into the room. And today, it's aliens. And so the culture tells you what you're supposed to interpret that odd brain anomaly as. So it's a mental phenomenon. It's a brain anomaly, and then the culture tells you what you're supposed to call it or interpret it or how the narrative is supposed to be constructed. Since we live in the age of science and science fiction and Star Trek and E.T. and so on, that's our angels.
Now, I understand. I once interviewed a sleep expert. He said that when we dream, we are paralyzed. We're paralyzed when we dream. Otherwise, we sleepwalk and create all sorts of mischief.
Yeah.
However, there are these people, 1 in 50 or so, who, when they wake up, they're in this dream state where they are paralyzed, but they're conscious, semi-conscious.
Yes.
And then they have these, nightmare recollections under hypnosis, which brings us out.
That's right. And there is a small percentage also who don't have that, but they have recovered memories of being abducted. And we know now that recovered memories are completely unreliable. They're brought forth by therapists who already believe in aliens and ask them leading questions. And then in the hypnotic sessions, they construct false memories in their own minds of things that actually never happened, and we now know that that's really easy to do.
And isn't that how people say that if you get hypnotized, you can go back to the days of Julius Caesar, and why people claim that they are actually Mark Antony or Cleopatra reincarnated? Because the therapist evokes images of ancient Egypt and the movie Cleopatra.
That's right. Why is it that no one, with reincarnation, no one ever comes back and says, well, I was a shoe shiner.
Or mass murderer.
Yeah, mass murderer. I was a grave digger. I was a nobody. I didn't do anything.
They're always Cleopatra. Right?
Yeah, it's always something kind of sexy and cool.
Right. Okay, now, if you go to Europe, many Europeans are amazed that Americans are still fixated over this, the monkey trial of many decades ago. It's a settled question in Europe. In fact, Darwin is on the money in England.
Yes, I know.
However, here it's quite a volatile issue. Why here and not in Europe?
Well, in part because we have separation of church and state, and that drives churches to be much more aggressive in their pursuit of their religion. And the kind of religion practiced here tends to be more fundamentalist, more literalist in its interpretation. Now, mind you, this is they're still a minority, but they're a vocal minority, and they're a vocal minority that have money and therefore some political clout. So they're a lot more vocal than they actually are powerful, but nevertheless, they're there. And so the four strategies they've developed since the Scopes trial. The first strategy was banning the teaching of evolution, and that resulted in the Scopes trial. The second strategy in the 60s after Sputnik and the reintroduction of science into and Darwin into public school classrooms brought forth demands for equal time for Darwin and Genesis, and they lost all those battles on First Amendment grounds. Third strategy, 70s and 80s, was to demand equal time for evolution science and creation science. They just put a hyphen and stuck a word on the end as if that makes it science. And they lost those battles, including all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1987, where the 9 justices voted 7-2 to uphold the Louisiana ban on equal time laws, and that killed creationism once and for all, or so I thought. But as it goes, creationism keeps evolving and mutating into new species, which it's not supposed to be able to do. And in the 1990s arose this intelligent design movement, which is not your father's creationism. It's much more sophisticated. It's done by guys with PhDs, some of whom actually have academic jobs, and they write books that are much more sophisticated than the old creationist books, and they have an agenda called the wedge in which they want to break down the wedge separating church and state, and it begins with the secular materialistic worldview, which they believe is embodied in science in general and Darwin in particular. So that's where they got this idea, is we have to topple Darwin and the theory of evolution to begin our long program of reintroducing Christianity into American public life. That is their goal. So whenever somebody pretends to be doing science, that's our bailiwick. That's what the skeptics do. We jump in there and say, okay, let's see your evidence. And so my book, I actually have a whole long chapter in which I have all of their arguments, the top 10 arguments they present and the counters to them. And then I go on from there, exploring their agenda and their motives and so on.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of those. Some of the creationists claim that humans coexisted with the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were wiped out by the flood, that the world is only 6,000 years old. But what are your thoughts, and what are some of their best arguments?
Now, on that, the modern intelligent design creationists, they don't believe any of that you just said. Those are young Earth creationists. They have purposely distanced themselves from them so that they can make more make more ground in public schools. So they say, no, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. We recognize that. Evolution does happen. It's microevolution, not macroevolution. And the flood was a mythic story. It didn't literally happen. So by doing that, they've been able to curry a lot of favor amongst more thoughtful, intellectual people who do read the Bible more allegorically and metaphorically than literally. So their best arguments have to do with biology, and particularly the structure of DNA, the structure of the eye, the blood clotting mechanism, the bacterial flagellum, the little tail that, like on a sperm cell, a little tail like that propels cells, and any kind of complex molecular biological structure or function that they don't think Darwin or Darwinian theory can explain. That's where they think the intelligent designer stepped into our space and time and tweaked the system to get that going. That's their core belief.
And what is their best shot? If you were to try to tear down Darwin using that point of view, what is their best shot?
The best shot is to try to find and Darwin himself said this in The Origin of Species, if somebody could show where it would be impossible to have a stepwise, gradual buildup of a structure or function, then my theory would be shot. So that's what they're always looking for. They call this irreducible complexity, some sort of system in which if you took out one part, it wouldn't work anymore, therefore it's irreducibly complex structure that can't work without all the parts. Therefore, how would a stepwise, gradual Darwinian method system build, say, an eye or a wing? Well, let's just take the wing, because that's such a classic one. We can certainly see what a fully functioning wing would do for an organism. It's adaptively functional. It's great for getting away from predators, catching prey, and so on. But what good would half a wing do, or 10% of a wing? How do you go from 0 wing to 1% of a wing all the way up to 100% of a fully functioning wing? Until you get to 100%, you can't fly. The answer is that it was not a poorly adapted wing along the way. It was a well-adapted something else, that something else being probably a thermoregulating device. Wings are terrific for gathering, collecting heat, or holding heat in next to the body. Wings are also terrific for, like in penguins, to use as submarine devices, that is, for controlling motion through the water. Wings are also good for, as it turns out, animals that are running along the ground, particularly if they're going uphill, can go faster if they push with their wings along the ground or just push the air back. They don't actually have to achieve flight at all. They get a terrific advantage for running speed. And we know about already gliding squirrels, for example. You don't have to have fully functioning flapping wings. You can use ersatz wings for gliding. And all of those are stepwise ways that you can get from no wing to fully functioning flying wing, because they were used for something else and then later co-opted for the current use that we see.
And what about the eye? The eye,
well, it's not true that the human eye, say, is irreducibly complex. If you took out any one part, it wouldn't work at all. That's not true. Lots of people have various vision disorders in which they can only see partially, but they can see partially, and believe me, they'd rather see partially than not at all. It does give them some advantage. So it's not true. And in any case, if you look at just the current animal kingdom, you will find a whole sequence of eyes, from the simplest you can imagine, a single eye spot on a very simple organism in which its only job is to turn on or off if there's any kind of light at all, to a handful of eye spots, to a little pit that has a whole bunch of eye cells, that is light-sensitive cells, that give a tiny bit of directionality to the light, to a deeper eye pit in which you get kind of a crude image forming. There's no lens yet, but a crude image forming on the pit that has all these light-sensitive cells, and all the way up to the modern mammalian complex eye. So there is already a stepwise sequence just in current animals, then you can reconstruct how that could have happened from the fossil record.
And also from DNA, it used to be said in textbooks that the eye developed independently, evolutionarily speaking, many times in the past. But looking at the DNA, that's apparently not true. Looking at the DNA, apparently all the so-called independent developments of the eye came from one original gene, where I think it was sensitive to light because of the chemical rhodopsin.
Yeah, that's right.
And that then set into motion all the other eyes, which we see in the fossil record, so that misled us into thinking that the eye developed many times. But actually, it was just one mutation,
yep.
Hundreds of millions of years ago that set everything into motion.
Yeah, it's remarkable what we've been able to learn from the new science of evo-devo, and how single gene mutations or chromosomal replications can increase the amount of complexity of an organism instantly, or start a whole new lineage of different structures, such as eyes or wings or something like this. A whole new set of body plans, for example, in the Cambrian explosion, that Gould writes about, the Burgess Shale. There's all these new experiments going on here, and that can happen from an explosion. So, in that sense, insisting that everything be explained by Darwinian, stepwise, very gradual, incremental steps is not always the case. And we know this now from modern genetics and evolutionary development.
Well, I'm afraid that's it for Exploration. Once again, our special guest today was Michael Shermer, founder of the Skeptics Society. He has a column in Scientific American. And you can find more about him by going to the Skeptics Society website.